when we spoke earlier, your perspective on principles over processes is fascinating. Could you unpack what principles first means in practice and how it shapes the way you build processes at OLX?
With a principles first approach, what I've discovered is it helps establish the direction, right? It's almost like you call the North Star metrics. It's basically the principles help us create the process based on the reality of the teams, the reality of the context, how they work. And sometimes what people don't understand is there's some work that has to be done before you can get to that process. But what people see is the end process worked really well. And let's scale that out.
What's your secret sauce for ensuring visibility and alignment across teams at OLX?
Being completely honest.
Hugo, welcome to the Product Founder podcast. I'm super excited to talk with you today. Can you a little bit introduce yourself and how did you got into the product management world?
Hi. Yeah, it's great to be here. My name is Hugo Froes. I am head of product operations at OLX. Now, OLX is a classifieds marketplace, and right now we're mostly based in Europe. In Portugal, Romania, and Poland are our three main markets, and then some other Eastern European countries, and also in South Africa. So, for example, Auto Trade in South Africa and Property24, they're part of our flagship, right? And we also belong to a company which is Prosus, which is an investment conglomerate, right? That they invest in many different companies, and we're part of their portfolio, right? And the complex thing about OLX is that it's a marketplace that has two verticals. One is around motor vehicles, like we call it the motors, which is motor vehicles, and then we've got products, standalone products. Then we've got the same in real estate. And then we've got the OLX brand, which is similar to eBay or things like that, which is buying and selling of used goods online. And it's an open marketplace, right? So both B2C, B2B, whatever you want, right? You can, and C2C. Myself, how do I get into product? It's interesting because I started building digital products in 2007. Mostly starting in the user experience area. Then I went into design thinking. I did some also service design and doing consultancy. And then what happened was I went into small startups. I was working with product organizations and seeing how they worked. I tried various different ways. I also worked as a consultant. And then strangely enough, there was this transition that happened, which we went into product operations, myself and the entire team a few years back, because the work we were doing was bringing value. And they said, well, design is okay. We need it in product, right? And so we kind of transitioned to the product. And I've been working in product operations now for the past, I don't want to lie, but it's been already 4, maybe 5 years, right? So it's been a while. And I've had the opportunity of seeing it grow and looking at this in the development of product organizations. I remember in the beginning when it was the web designers, right, who did almost everything. I had to learn coding. I had to learn tons of other stuff. I learned how to use Google Analytics right at the beginning and all that stuff. And now in the past few years, it's been more around, you've got these multidisciplinary teams, you've got these agiles, you've got the Scrum, you've got thousands of methodologies and things. And so being able to see this evolution, right, and this complexity growing, it's been super fun over the past few years.
Awesome. Going back to OLX, I want to understand it a little bit better, then we can go more deeper into other topics. So I know it has a marketplace which operates in different countries, but you talked about something about vehicles. Is that like you manufacture part of the vehicle or you sell them, or it's a marketplace? How does that look
similar?
like?
It's a similar concept, which is a marketplace where we've got basically we create the platform, or we provide a platform for both professionals and private sellers who want to sell their products, and they can use our product, right? And for example, for professional sellers, we tend to create a lot of leads for them, right? It's a large quantity of leads because it's an open marketplace. But also we give them a whole bunch of tools that can help them, leverage their stock and help sell it better. But even now what we're doing is we're also exploring, and we've started going to the world of financing, right? So we've got a new product, which is we help with financing and in some cases leasing as well. And so we're testing out these different models, but even car inspections, right? There is a small service we have in Poland right now, which is you want to buy your car, you're not sure, it's a used car. We can do it. We can do a certified inspection and then provide that service for you. So you know there's a certain level of confidence that the car's not going to fall apart a month after you've bought it, right? especially when we're talking about the used cars. And then in real estate, it's the same thing, right? It's a very similar thing where we provide both for the professionals and the private sellers. What we see in the OLX side is it's more around the private sellers. So there's less of the professionals in there, but there is still the professionals, right? And we've got some very interesting areas there where we've got quite a strong level of penetration. Super interesting.
Let's pause here for a second. The other day, I was looking into our channel analytics and I noticed many of you guys are watching a lot of our episodes but not yet subscribed to our YouTube page or Spotify. I will ask you as a favor, please support us by subscribing to our YouTube page and Spotify page, and I will promise you I will do everything in my power to make each episode better and better. Thank you. And which part are you focusing right now?
My focus is across all of them. So, and what this means is because working in product operations, we focus more on the teams, right? On the organization, on the well-being, on the development, the maturity of the organization, the practices, and that kind of thing. And previously I was working more in the motors space, but now what happened is I've taken over the team that's overlooking across Europe. So now what we have is we have some people working on the motors stuff, others working on the real estate, others working on OLX. And in some cases, we're working on initiatives that are across all of them. So we look and we see what's working really well. How can we scale it out to the other teams, right? It's about spotlighting the good, taking advantage of these things and slowly scaling them out and starting to build consistencies and taking the best advantages of each of them to hopefully build a better organization.
And where are the product managers located within the world? Like how many headquarters do you have and how is it kind of separated in a way?
Yeah. So our main headquarters is in the Netherlands. However, we have hubs in Portugal. We have 2 hubs in Poland and we have a hub in Romania. And we also have some folks in Spain and some folks in Berlin. It depends. So for example, with motors, majority of the teams are in Portugal, for example. With real estate, majority are in Poland, although we do start having some in Portugal as well. And with the OLX, also majority on Poland and some in Portugal and a few in Berlin, right? And it all depends. We've got people distributed across these main geographies. Then we've got smaller teams potentially, for example, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, in some of these countries, we still have smaller teams.
And the one in the Netherlands, which is the main headquarters, like kind of which team is focused there?
It's not there. It's mostly, so we have some of our C-level folk there, also because it's where process is established, right? And so we also have our CEO is there, I lie. Our CEO is in Berlin, but we have, for example, our CFO, right? We have some people in the Netherlands, but then it's mostly the C-levels, right? We've got 1 or 2 other small groups of people working there, but it's most of the product teams are in Poland or Portugal with some working in Spain.
When we spoke earlier, your perspective on principles over processes is fascinating. Could you unpack what principles first means in practice and how it shapes the way you build processes at OLX?
It's an interesting concept, right? So our tendency is when we see a problem, right? We want to solve it. We want the product organization to get better. What do? I've read 500 books or whatever. I come up with a great process. I build it end to end. It's incredible. I implement it and I've put everything there, right? I've answered every question. I've taken in consideration every single step. What I've found is that's generally the first step to a disaster that's going to break down in 2 to 3 years. Because the problem is that process usually isn't adaptable. It's not something that can go changing. It's not scalable as well, right? It's built for a very specific time stamp, a specific time in the organization. When you're working in a startup, that's fine, right? Because we can change processes almost every week if we want, test out whatever we want. But when we're working in big organizations, when you do this, you've just made a change and now you say, oh, it didn't work. I have to change it. It's going to be another 6 months to a year to get it right? With a principles first approach, what I've discovered is that if we focus on first defining the principles or the guardrails, the guidelines that people are driven by, it helps us to establish the direction, right? It's almost like you call the North Star metrics or the direction you're going, right? It gives you that spotlight. It gives you this tells you where you want to go, how you want to go, and which direction you want to go. Then what happens is, in terms of the process, is we give enough space for people to start trying and testing out their own ways of working, as long as they follow those big top level baseline, right? And people say, oh, but there has to be consistency, or else it's going to break if everybody works. Everybody works in their own way. So what we try and do there is, okay, we try and pinpoint key points where things have to be consistent and be connected. But those come after you've decided on these guiding principles, right? So it's basically the principles then help us create the process, right? Based on the reality of the teams, the reality of the context, how they work. And what we found is, in that case, we managed to have much lighter processes, much more adaptable, and to an extent, less documentation. So it's almost like an agile approach to building processes. And it also goes back to something I read. I don't know if you've ever read a great book, which is The Switch Book by Chip and Dan Heath. And their concept is, the whole book is around one little change that you can do, or small change that will have the most impact. And the truth of the matter is that what I've found is, when you start changing a process, right, any change you're going to make is going to have a ripple effect. So it's going to change other parts of the process. So trying to assume that by changing this part, I will automatically know how the rest of the process is going to work, most cases you won't, right? So what I like to do is see how that that change is going to impact. And depending on that impact, then we change on the next part, right? And so it's iterative and development and everything like that. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to do this because, when you tell people, here's this thing, and I'm not going to define everything for you, right? They go into panic mode. It's like, well, what do you mean? What should I do here? They start talking about the hedge cases, about the 500 things. And it's like, I turn around to them and I say, you decide, right? And that's what we try and do. We try and tell them, look, you decide. If you define something and it works really well, tell us, because we can then scale it out to other teams maybe. So what we do is we actually leverage learning that is happening within the teams to then bring this back and evolve the process. And, so it's the principles inform a process, and then the process creates practices. It's like this kind of thing. It's these habits. It's like they build on each other, rather than this thing of, oh, here is all the documentation. Here's the whole process end to end. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't work in every single situation. Sometimes we do have to come with a really well structured everything, with everything thought out for everyone, because it's completely new for them, or we want to make sure we're creating that behavior. We want to drive those forcing functions. So we have to be careful. It's a balance. We have to test this out depending on the situation.
When you were thinking of scaling a process, right, you just talked about sometimes some internal teams comes up with something, you see it's working, but then you try to maybe implement that across the organization. In your experience, usually what I would say breaks that process when you scale it, like even globally for a company like OLX?
Well, the thing is, it's what breaks it are various things. Number one is, let's say, for example, team A, you implemented the process, right? Or the group A, you implemented that process. It works for them because they've been working on something that was the baseline for that for a while. And so it just fits, right? And sometimes what people don't understand is there's some work that has to be done before that can be done, before you can get to that process. But what people see is the end process worked really well, and, oh, let's scale that out. It's like, well, I can't scale that out to other teams because they haven't done that pre-work that this team did, right? For example, another thing that can happen is when you don't take into consideration the context, sometimes even the culture, right? Something we have to be careful of, because, if I'm talking, and I've seen this even in our company, right? If I'm talking to people who are in Portugal, or Portuguese, for example, versus people in Romania or Polish, they do have a different way of looking at things. And so we have to cater for that differences as well, right? Even their market, right? They've been built up in a different way across these markets, right? Even the way of the regulation and even the way product maturity is in these different cultures, they're different, right? They're developed in different ways. And so we have to take that into consideration. And so it's not just a simple thing of, oh, it's just like printing out, 500 copies. It doesn't always work. And that's what we have to give space for, because almost any time I try and implement a process, a team will look and say, that sounds great, but now I have to explain our context. And they go into this, right? So what we try and do is at least maintain the context of these teams so that even when we're thinking about the scaling out, we already try and do some pre-work so that it doesn't break when we go into the new teams, ideally.
Yeah, absolutely. Planning and alignment are core challenges for any organization. What's your secret sauce for ensuring visibility and alignment across teams at OLX?
We haven't got this right yet. Being completely honest,
Okay.
we haven't got it right yet, right? But every single year since I've joined the company, it's gotten a bit better, right?
Why do you think you haven't got it right yet?
Well, it's various things, right? So one is, I mean, we can go into various. I can go into various directions, but let me see if I can focus on a few things. So, number one is people struggle against anything that tells them that they should, because the whole industry tells people that they should be iterative and work in cycles and slowly develop things, right? But then what we're telling them is, guess what? You need to plan almost a year in advance. And people say, but that's ridiculous. I don't know what the market's going to be like in a year. And you say, it's great, I understand, but in a big organization, you basically have to negotiate to have the budget to do the things you want to do the next year, right? And this has to be because we have stakeholders, we have, we have investors, we have all these things. We have to prepare for these things. And also, right, if you want to go in a direction and you want to innovate, right? And I think we discussed innovation previously, right? It's if you don't actually do these plans, you can't innovate because someone will turn around and say, I'd love you to work on that for 6 months, but I don't understand what it is because you haven't thought about it properly, right? Or someone will say, I'd love to, but I can't hire more people for you because you haven't asked for a budget for that, right? And people say, oh no, but I should be able to hire when I need to. Fiscally, these things don't work that way, right? But people aren't used to that. So they kind of fight against it. They resist it a lot, right? That's one part. Then another part that happens is people always want to change how they want to do this, right? People turn around and say, oh no, we're going to focus on 2, 3 maximum big things this year. These are going to be our big bets. And what happens is someone turns around and says, oh, but you know what? I saw something cool around AI. Oh, I saw something cool around, the virtual reality. Oh, I saw something. And so, it's suddenly you look and you say, well, our goals or our yearly plans went from 3 things to now 20 things. And it's like, whoa, how does this filter down into the teams? It's too many directions, too many different things. Now, what we have found is there's in parallel, there's 2 things that work really, really well. And this is where we've seen the most impact is when we give them a very clear notion of what's the direction we want to go. So you give them a kind of North Star. Sometimes it can be an actual metric that you have, but it's about a North Star, giving them clarity on what is our focus for this year. And the top level leadership has an important part to play here, right? They cannot be, oh, I'll change the strategy or my ideas every single week, right? We have to be very focused. And then, having these metrics that you can, following the North Star metric framework, right, where you have a North Star, but then you have all the input metrics, the health metrics, all the metrics beneath that, whether you want to call it a KPI tree, a metric tree, or whatever, or value-driven tree, right? These metrics help us also to understand what we have to measure that will have impact on that top level, which sometimes teams don't have, right? So we ask them to plan something and everything, and people are like, yeah, I think it should be this because I saw a trend and all that. But then when you realize, if you really dig deep, it's not attached to that top level, strategy, vision that you want to go. So setting these up. And we've used the OKRs, but it's not just about the OKRs in its sense, but it's also about giving people that direction again, right? It's about being very clear on these things. And we have to push back. We have to tell teams, look, less OKRs. There's too many OKRs on your list and everything. So trying to get these working, it's hard. But if you have the metrics along with a proper framework to basically ladder up and connect the things, it helps a lot. And that's what we found. This year, we're hoping it gets even better. Every single year, it's been better and better. And this year, so far, the conversations are going really well. So.
How do you set the OKRs? Because in my experience, sometimes, for example, you set the OKRs for the sales team to, I don't know, sell or reach this much amount of revenue. So the sales team starts to push the product team to shift a couple of features will increase the revenue, right? But the product team has its own OKRs, which is, I don't know, focus on more like acquire more user, so these OKRs are not aligned to each other. And then kind of you see internal teams start to compete or fight with each other.
Well, that's the thing. You just described the perfect problem of what they're having, which is each has their own OKRs. And what we're doing is what we're looking at internally is we look at how can we actually align better. So, for example, the person from the commercial side, right? The top person at the commercial side and the top person at the product side will sit down and they will say, you know what, I'm thinking this is our strategy for this next year. And the other will say, okay, I kind of agree. And they'll negotiate between the two of them. If this conversation isn't happening, it's going to happen exactly like you were describing it, right? Each one's going to go and they're going to be arguing. From their side, it's like, build me this feature. And the other side saying, no, that doesn't make sense. And I'm not going to do that because I've got my own plans. And so they argue. Whereas if they aligned previously, and we found out that one of the things is when we have a yearly cycle, for example, we've got one of our tribes that does that really well, is there's a yearly cycle that happens. Our fiscal year starts in basically April, right? They have a conversation in about October, November, the previous year, where they sit down with their counterparts on the commercial side. They bring in sales, customer success, they'll bring in marketing, all these other teams. They'll sit down and they'll say, okay, actually, let's think about it. What actually makes sense? And then the rest of it is about negotiating small little bits and pieces, right? But everybody's clear on what's the direction they want to go in. What are the things that make sense, right? What are the big plans for the next year? Knowing that some things will be, might change slightly because, for example, you can know with confidence what's going to be built in the next quarter. What's after that? It depends, right? What you learn, that the market changed, something broke that we weren't expecting, whatever, right? But you at least plan with them and they have a notion that you're trying to drive in that direction, right? And they also tell you, but also we have needs, we have expectations. So how can we make sure we're aligned on that? And so they try and do these alignments sooner rather than later. That's the big difference, right? Sometimes it's a simple thing of get people sitting and talking for 1 or 2 days. And it's just that, right? And it's like, oh, it's so hard and everything is like, it is if you don't do it, if you never start doing it. But we found that by putting these people together earlier, it's better. It's not perfect, but we still get a lot better results if we can get these people talking beforehand.
Amazing. I know insight management is a big topic for you. Why do you think many organizations struggle to create their intake properly? And what solutions have you found work best?
Yeah, when we're talking about insights management, right, it's complicated because we have, in even the smallest companies, we may have 3 to 4 different sources of input, right? So we've got customer calls, we've got sales, we've got, whatever, we've got surveys going out, if you've got an app, you've got app ratings on stores and things like that. Then we've got user interviews we're doing. If you've got data, you've got data analytics implemented. In some cases, some teams have CSATs and NPSs out there, right? So all of these different sources are coming in. And as a product manager, right? And maybe a question to you is, how often is it easy for you to go and in 5 minutes get the answer you need, right? Almost never. Why? Because you have to jump between all these different sources. And then assuming that, for example, let's go, for example, quantitative data. What do you have? You have 5 dashboards that you have to look at. None of them tells you exactly what you need. So you have to create another event, right? Or you have to ask them to then do a query for you to ask that specific thing. Same thing with user research, right? You've got maybe 5 different reports sitting around somewhere. If you're lucky, your organization has built a research repository, but still, you've got tons of insights in there to try and explore it. So the thing is, the product manager or the designer or whoever wants to find out the data will spend tons of time looking for that. What do? They'll give up and they'll say, actually, I'll just do new research. I'll ask the researcher or the data analyst to actually find this for me and they can give me the info. So now you've become dependent on someone else. If they don't have the bandwidth, then you have to wait for them to answer you, right? All these things. So the problem is, it's exactly that. We haven't considered properly all of this. How do we bring all this data together? So we're great when we handle all the data coming from quant, all the data coming from qual, from interviews. Then we've got the other qual data. So we don't bring it all together, right? There's some tools out there trying to do something around that, but none of them has got that completely perfect, right? So it's about this intake process. And Thomas Sharon wrote incredible content about 6 years ago or more around democratizing research. And he talked about and then he talks about atomic research as well, which was then by Daniel, I don't want to lie, Pidcock. I can't remember his name right now, but he developed atomic research, right? And the whole concept there was exactly, number one, you have all these different ways where people can contribute to research or to information or to this data. And so that's what you have to do. You have to create the system for the intake, right? When you're having sales, CS, whatever, it has to go somewhere and it has to be handled. It's not just, I'm going to put a quick tag on SAS on SAP or one of these other tools, right? It's like, no, we're actually going to do some work and it goes to a specific repository. Then the actual sifting through this, actually synthesizing it, doing it, creating a process around that, right? Some people will say, oh, researchers will do one part, data will do another part. That's not done properly. And then the last part is the curation. And this is the super interesting part. Nobody wants to spend 3 hours looking for through these reports, looking through all these things. You want to find the stuff. That's why, for example, I remember a couple of years ago when Google Analytics was starting to get some market penetration, you could go in there and you could go, I want to find out about this data source, that event, this and that. You could do that in 5 minutes, right? But then they started saying, oh, we want to do, we want to connect it to shopping. We want to connect it to your search engines. It starts getting confusing again. Unless you're a data analyst, it can get very confusing, right? And they say, oh, now we're going to teach product managers, we're going to teach designers and all these folks how to do queries. We're going to teach them how to look into data. We're going to teach them how to set up events and everything. It's like, what the hell? No, these products can do this stuff, right? And so it's about curating that. It's about making it self-serve, because that's the thing. You should be able to easily go there. One of the things I'm seeing now in the markets is a lot of people are trying to plug in these chat GPTs or these conversational AIs to at least be able to, hey, I'm going to just do a conversation and it extracts the information for me. The problem is that there's still a bias around the chat GPTs and things like that. When it's too much content, right, it's too much for them to sift through. So it's going to take a long time. It's not as easy, but there are some teams trying to do that, right? They're trying to do workarounds, whether you do it by your tagging, your categorization, or how you do the structuring of that information. They're trying to improve it. So we are seeing some advances in this. The problem is nobody's actually done this, where you can have this whole process where great intake of data, all the data is connected, quant, qual, whatever data, is properly curated for them to be able to use, and a PM, a designer, whoever needs to, can go and in 5 minutes find what they're looking for, right? I mean, yeah, I think we're still missing that part, and I think we need to develop a bit more.
I really like your point on simplifying things, keeping things simple. And I think that's very good intro to my next question. So keeping things simple can be surprisingly difficult. How do you identify and cut through the bloat in product development?
That's a very good question. I mean, the simplification is something we keep forgetting about. Right. People talk about we have to be agile, we have to be whatever, we have to keep producing, and people keep forgetting the whole concept of everything. Right. And I think you and I discussed this previously, but it goes back to the concept of we keep forgetting our baseline principle of why we're here. And so what I like to go back to is always the concept of first principles, right? Which is, what is the fundamental reason for why we are doing something? And with product development, it's the same thing, right? And the concept is very simple. It's, we are here to deliver value to customers, to people, right? And if you want to use the concept of jobs to be done or whatever you want to call it, right? But the idea is that, why is our product solving or doing the job that solves a problem for that user, right? Or for that customer, that they will be comfortable in paying for it. And it's just that simple. Now, what we've done is we've started thinking, oh, you know what? I've read Marty Kagan's books. I've read, Teresa Torres. I've read Melissa, and all this content is super rich. The problem is people look at it and they say, well, now I have to build a multidisciplinary team that is structured in X way. I have to do this in that way. My organization has to build that. And they've lost concept of what we're trying to do, right? And if you go back to the basics, and I don't know if you've ever read or followed the works of the folks from, I can't remember the name of the studio, but they wrote the rework books, the creators of Basecamp, Ruby on Rails, and that kind of stuff. What they do is they have a very simple concept, which is they build a core team. They've got an idea for a product. They've got an idea for something. They build a core team of maybe 4 or 5 people, right? And those 5 people are full stack. So you'll have a designer doing accounting, you'll have an engineer doing marketing, you'll have a PM doing whatever, right? PR and stuff like that, right? They'll sit down and they might have to do stuff, and they'll even learn coding, right? A PM might learn coding. And what they do is they first validate if the product is worthwhile, if it's something that makes sense and everything like that. And then what they do is they try and keep the team as small as possible. So what they do is they only grow it by the amount that is needed for what they're trying to produce, never the other way around, right? It's not that type of thing where now we're going to grow 50 people. It's like, no, we're never going to grow 50 people. And their teams stay, I might be mistaken, but I don't think their teams ever go beyond like 20 or 25 people. And they've got products that funding zero, and all their products are making tons of money across the world, and they're being adopted by thousands of people, right? It's a great concept. And I think this is the thing, right? One of the things we forget is, what do we actually need to build a product, right? We need product managers? No. We need designers and we need an engineer. Why? So that way we've got the interface covered and we've got the back end covered, right? And people might go into panic mode and think PM is dead, just like everybody's saying. And it's like, that's not what I'm saying. What happens is all of these other roles we have are to bring extra value, right? They to help us. They bring that extra value to build the product in a better way, right? You don't need them. They're nice to have, but they're a nice to have that brings value. That value that they bring is dependent on the need of the organization, of the customers, where we're going. For example, design ops, product ops, all of these roles, right? Everybody's like, oh, we have to hire. I've seen teams that don't need ops because they work really well. They manage to structure themselves really well. They've managed to solve the things and scale out their processes and practices really well. Fine. Sometimes in some organizations, I'll go in there and designers, for example, do that really well, actually. Design ops sometimes is one of the most redundant roles for me because designers do it really well and they usually have, but it's not to say it works well in every case because some organizations have grown really, really quickly and then suddenly they need help in these things. But it brings value. Where needed, it can bring that value, right? The same thing with PM role, data analyst, right? Because, I mean, myself, when I was starting out, right, we didn't have all these roles that exist today. I had to learn how to do coding, front end, back end. I had to do analytics. I even learned how to do user research. I learned how to do all these things. Was I doing them incredibly well? No. But I was doing enough that I could get away with it and do a lot of stuff, right? And the thing is, it's a lot about people think, oh, it has to be automatically a multidisciplinary team. And you look and you say, think about what you actually need, right? And it's okay to have, let's say, for example, let's say 2/3 of your team don't have a PM and a designer, maybe. That's okay. Maybe they can get by without that, right? Whereas in other organizations, you will need designers for each team or PM. It all depends, right? It all depends on the maturity, but it can't be the baseline of every single time a pack will have X amount, right? I tend to think it'll break that way. Yeah. Long story short, but
yeah, no, that's perfect. I think people are not really forgetting that we are here to simplify things. I think simplicity doesn't have value. Like, let me explain. If I could design the Nike logo in 5 minutes, or if I'm a company that you hire me, we spend hours going through the vision, what you want to achieve, and we are a fancy company, you pay us 1,000 euros for the Nike logo, which one has more value? Obviously the company that you paid, right? You're like, I spent like 50,000 euro on this, but the outcome is quite the same, right? I feel like in the product world, that's where why the role is becoming fancy, right? You have all these frameworks and you go through all these crazy things to reach the outcome X, or come and like to reach that specific idea that maybe you could have just thought about that in a like much faster way. Maybe you could have approached it easier, like you could have built it in a more easier. No, we want all the advanced things, right? So because it's more advanced, because it's more difficult, we tend to think that it's more valuable. And I don't think this is a problem within necessarily like the product community. I think it's more like a management issue, that if I was simplify things, they might say, I can give this work to an AI, right? Why do I need this guy to even be there, right? So
But I love that. And it's exactly what I see, right? For example, you see, I talk to a lot of vendors, right? And I talk to a lot of teams, and I go in there and I say, okay, look, what I need is a product that's going to solve problem X. And they come and they give me a laundry list of great features that the product does. And I said, but does it solve X? And they say, well, yes, kind of, but here is a laundry list of features, right? And the concept is exactly that. I think people are being pressured. And don't get me wrong, I think it's more around the product industry or product development industry as a whole, not just specific people. But it is this thing of, we have to have a bloated team. We have to build features every single week. If we're not pushing features, and then people read articles about how Amazon is pushing thousands of, experiments per hour or something like that. And it's like, don't get me wrong, they're a huge organization and they have to do those experiments because their product has reached a huge maturity. And so they can't go in there and say, oh, I suddenly want to change the whole front end of my product. But when a product is developing, when you're still getting that market fit, when you're still in the low level maturity, you still have to make some big changes, right? And to your point, many people have forgotten just the simple logic of there's such a thing as, if you follow base logic, if you follow, best practices and things like that, it covers maybe 50% of the potential things, right? And it's like, I use the example. I was working I was head of a product at the time. Well, I was working, overlooking a product in Portugal for a while now, for about 9 years. And when I tell people I was growing 10 to 20% every single year, right? Our numbers were growing 10 to 20% every single year. And they say, incredible, you're doing tons of user experience stuff. And I said, no, no, no. When we started doing user experience stuff, we started seeing some of the numbers going up 160 and 200%, right? But just with baseline logic, it was growing every year, right? Because I would look at what best practices on the thing. I would test things out. I would try them out and everything like that, right? And people are like, oh, I have to validate everything with an experimental A/B test. And it's like, no, there's a lot of things you don't. Just put it live, right? And people are going into saying, oh, because if I don't do this, if I don't put it in customers' hands, and it's like, well, if you're talking about 5% of 2% of your customers, just put it live. Seriously, do not waste more time of your time, right? These simple things, people don't almost go on their expertise. We build up expertise to be an expert in an area. The idea is that you will have some know-how and some stuff, right? I mean, obviously it's calculated risks. I'm not saying to just throw it all in the wind and do your best, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of most of these methodologies that exist out there. But like you're saying, these frameworks and all of these different tools have become a crutch. And people have stopped thinking, right? It's like, okay, folks, come on. If I wanted you to stop thinking, then we would hire, like you were saying, an AI or something like that, right? It's like, but like you said, I think it's habit, right? We incentivize these habits. The industry incentivizes this. People always feel like they have to, because everybody says, oh, you have to do all the design thinking stuff, and you now all the technologies you do, or the frameworks, you have to use them. And I tell my students when I give those classes, I tell them, I guarantee you never need more than 2 or 3 of these frameworks for any given project, right? And I've done full consultancy projects, because you only need what you need to solve the problem at that time. But you need to build up that know-how, that maturity. Yeah, but I've gone off on another tangent. But
No, absolutely. Also, maybe another issue I see is why we are having this many framework is for a product manager to put a name for himself out there. He needs to create a framework, and then he needs to push that framework and go to all these conferences and keep talking about it, and then provide a workshop about that specific framework. So he becomes more popular. Plus, he can provide consultation to those companies that they can fix the issue which they have by using his framework, right? I don't know if marketing is exactly like this or not, but definitely in product, I feel it's like this. I don't know what's your opinion about it.
no, I agree completely, right? I'll be honest, when I go to a conference and someone says, you know what, I have a framework for that. And I'm like, I actually made a joke in a recent conference when I was presenting, I was talking about principles over processes. And halfway through, I said, oh, guess what, folks? Now I've got a framework to show you how you can do that, right? And people looked at me and I said, no, I'm joking. I'd be a hypocrite if I said I had a framework, right? But it's true, right? There's a lot of this. Look, everybody's trying to get recognized, right? Which I understand. It's a hard industry. It's being flooded by people for a while now. I mean, the industry's kind of taking a flip now, right? It's getting a bit better. But for a long time there, what happened was it was hard to get in. It's hard to get recognized. It's hard to get anything because everybody seems to want to do it. Everybody seems to want to be in this area. Everybody wants to be working. I mean, if I remember, we put out a role recently, and I'm not lying when I say we've got over 1,000 candidates. Right. And I thought, okay, but these people obviously are close to what we're talking. And when we go into it, it's like totally wrong, right? People who have no experience, but they want to get into product. So they put it there and everything. And so everybody's trying to get recognized. And this is how we used to do it 5, maybe 6 years ago, right? To get recognized, either you create a framework, you start writing online, right? You start talking to people, you start getting recognized in the industry and things like that. So people want to get recognized. And so I think everybody's just trying to kind of get attention, right? And everybody wants to be the next person who hits it big and say, oh, this is the big framework. But even just recently, there was one framework I saw, and I looked and I said, they're describing what was written about 10 years ago, just with a different name. It was exactly the same framework, right? They almost just changed the wording of some of the things and the names. You're like, there's nothing absolutely new here. And yet they're talking at a conference of 500 people. They're getting recognized for this, right? And people are like tweeting or whatever, or do they call it X thing? I don't know what it's called anymore. But or
no,
posting
tweeting,
on LinkedIn,
it's
right?
Still tweeting.
Yeah, and they're posting on there. It's like, oh, this is incredible. This is a game changer and everything like that. And you're like, no, actually it isn't. And I think it's bloating. It's going back to the concept of bloating, right? It becomes hard because you start saying, oh, because I'm using this framework. And I get this, for example, because we're looking at frameworks and ways of working. I'm constantly getting people saying, oh, I read this great article. What about this? And you look and you say, well, that's describing that process, right? Well, yes, but I love the way they framed this, right? And I get it, right? Everybody's trying to make a name for themselves and get recognized.
I'm just curious, like, what are the ways that a product person can make a name for himself? We can go to conferences to talk about. I like when they go to talk about a problem and then the solution for it, which is not a framework. I love that talks. They can write a book, which is usually from a framework. They write about a framework. It's rarely they talk about a product they have created because it's usually the founder's story, not their story. They can have a newsletter, which newsletter became extremely popular. Almost every product manager has one newsletter. What are the other ways that they can get a name?
The only thing I say is
They
whatever
can
you
go on
use.
podcasts.
Exactly, they can have podcasts, right? No, and that's the truth, right? Everybody has something, and it's so easy for you to create content online nowadays and all that. I think the thing is, it's about being relevant, right? And it's kind of why, let's say, for example, if we're talking about a podcast or a newsletter or something like that, you'll see some of them start getting some recognition or start getting a name for themselves. What happens is what they're saying is relevant, right? It's touching on a point that's important for people. It's building on that. If you're not relevant, the truth of the matter is sometimes also take a step back and say, should I be creating this content? Right? I mean, I know I went for about 3 or 4 years where I didn't submit to any conference because I looked and I said, I don't feel like I have anything new or interesting to share, right? Don't get me wrong. I've got tons of experience. And maybe if I sit down on a one-to-one conversation or a fireside chat and chat with people, they'll get extract value from that. But I looked and I said, unless I can put together a talk that people will come away saying, I want to try this out next week, and it brought value for him, and I understand why this is using framework A or B that isn't my frameworks, right? I use other people's frameworks, but using those frameworks, how it can bring value for me, right? If I can do that, that's the only reason I will create the content, right? And simple example, right? A framework I use or a methodology I use all the time, and people, it's interesting the amount of people who actually don't know it enough, right? Which is user story mapping, right? Created, but developed by Jeff Patton, right? And it's a simple thing. And when I tell people and I tell my students, I tell my colleagues, and I present it to them and I tell them, this is how you can use it. And it's the one framework I keep coming up and people are like, oh, this brings extra value. It helps me think. And I say, that's the only thing I wanted is for you to extra value. But I don't feel right going to a conference and suddenly telling people you should be using user story mapping. Jeff is doing an incredible job of that himself, right? He's doing that, his own work around that. So that's the thing, right? It's about being relevant. But like you said, sometimes it's about the networking. It's about getting to know people. Sometimes it's about going for a coffee with more experienced people. And what I found, this happens with me very often, is if a new, someone who's new to the product area or something like that, and they schedule some time with me and everything like that, what happens is, one, I start seeing how they think because they're talking to me about the topic. I can see how they're passionate, and I can also understand what they've understood and what they haven't understood. So you can understand their maturity level, right? They're also learning from a more experienced person in these cases, right? So we're both learning from each other. And then what's great is, in the future, when a role comes up, either with me or someone asks me, oh, do you have someone to recommend? I might turn around and say, you know what? Actually, I do. I have a person I could, you should talk to them. I like their vibe. I like the way they describe things. I like the way they explain. And in general, I thought that they had the right energy and stuff like that. I think they could bring a lot of value, right? And in some cases, I've never worked with any of those folks, right? But I can say they've maintained relevant, right? And you kind of want to give them a chance. Sometimes it's just a thing of, I'll make sure they get into our interview process, right? And that's it. I won't, and sometimes if I know the person, I'll actually step away from interviews to make sure that there's no bias. But I think to myself, I saw some potential here. I would like to see if this could give some, right? And so it's about maintaining this relevance and connecting to the people. It's super important. But like you said, right, there's so many opportunities. I mean, some people start their own startups. Other people join startups to build up their knowledge and know-how where they have the space to play around as much as possible. Other people manage to get into, trainee programs or, these internships where they're coached by more experienced people, but then, they build up experience and they manage to validate that they're valid people and they then get a job as well. There's so many different ways. I can't say that there's one. The content one, it has become a bit overloaded to an extent in some cases.
I think if we just wait 5 or 10 more years, this whole new generation of young people will absolutely enter. And I think they care less about the framework. They just in general, they're more against the structural work and processes, and they're more toward freedom. I think they don't follow the rules. They don't like corporate type of work as well. So I think we will have a new generation of product managers. And that's also what I like to focus on this podcast, is just the younger audience, right? Kind of separating the BS in the whole product world.
Well, don't get me wrong, right? It's not something new. I get product managers challenging me every single day, right? And they're like, oh, we should be doing it this way. Oh, we should be doing it that way, right? And they throw it, and it's like, I get it, right? And I get it. Don't get me wrong. But, one of the things that most people, those books are great because they do give you knowledge from more experienced people, right? And these people have looked at and they've recognized patterns in the industry, patterns in the way people behave. Don't get me wrong, those patterns might change because the industry is changing, right? But they do give you those patterns. Now, what happens is most people will look at that and say, they're telling me a company should work this way. I just came into this company and they're not working that same way, so this is a bust and I have to leave the company, right? You turn around and say, folks, context is different, right? Or this company still has to get there, right? They have to develop, they have to grow, right? This is a utopian of where you want to go. It's the type of thing where you turn around and say, you know what? I want to be able to run a marathon. And a person turns around and says, great. And you go and you start crossing the street and you say, oh, I got tired. I'm not going to get into a marathon. It's like, hold on. There's a process here. You first have to build up their stamina to maybe do, a local run, maybe then later half marathon, then maybe going to the marathon, right? You have to build this up. And most organizations want to be at that top level, at that premium level, and they can't get there. And one of the things that experience has taught me is there is a certain balance between the corporate and non-corporate, right? And I think there has to be this thing, and it's not, I'm not saying we have to accept that things have to be the traditional way and things have to be worked in this, it's always these structured ways. And no, I think we should challenge this all the time. The difference is that we also have to understand that some things at certain times will have to happen. Whether we like to or not, they will have to happen. It's not all just fun, right? At least we're not there yet. I mean, in a couple of years, maybe if we've all managed to augment, the AIs and all that, where they're doing most of the work for us and we just do the fun part, right? It's like, oh, I just want to think. I just want to rationalize and it builds it for me, right? We're not there yet. So there are some parts that you will have to do, and it's one of the arguments I have every single day. It's like, you can't know your customer if you don't go out and talk to your customer, right? You can't know your industry if you don't look about what you're in the industry you're working in, right? And people will turn around and say, oh, I think the industry is wrong. And you're like, it could be, but you have to get there. You have to understand where your industry is now to understand where you want to go, right? And a lot of people, and this is the same thing, it happened, for example, design. Everybody started talking about user experience like it was the new fad, the new incredible thing that came up and all that. Whereas if you look at the baseline of where design was born, right, it was about solving a problem for people. I'm going to design, we're talking about industrial design. I'm going to design a product for people to use and, ergonomics and whatever you want to call it, right? But it's about something to solve a problem for people. And then people are like, oh no, it's become about visual, creative. And it's like, no, that's a graphic artist or that's a fine artist. It's not design. But we lost this for almost, I don't know, I don't want to shoot it out there, but I can say it was kind of lost or forgotten or put aside for 15 to 20 years. And then people feel like they're discovering something new. Now you've got the whole group of designers now coming in and saying, oh, all these frameworks, all these concepts and everything, they're all broken. It's all wrong and everything like that. It's like, yes, but they're trying to bring us back to the baseline. And that's why I say always go back to first principles. Never lose sight. You can know 500 frameworks. You can accept or not accept what you want to accept. But always go back to the baseline of why the hell are we doing what we do, right? It's just that simple. And with that, potentially we would build less products, right? There's too many products out there. Maybe we would flood we would create more consistent, better structured products, right? Because we wouldn't be running after the flashy things only. It's a lot of things, but it's like, let's not forget why this, and whether you want to call it human-centered, nature-centered, whatever, there's 500 different things, right? But let's not forget, right? There's a purpose behind these things. And we have to think about that impact of what we do. And most people don't. So it's just like, let's produce.
Absolutely. If you go back in time to your younger self, would you tell him something different? Would you do something different?
I would probably say take more risks.
Take more risk. Okay.
Take more risks. It's interesting because, again, I grew up in a different stage, right? I mean, I remember when the internet was still very new, right? You didn't have these multidisciplinary product teams. You had, these web teams or whatever. And I remember the beginnings of the internet and all that when it was starting to get some penetration. So to an extent, we didn't have all the possibilities that one has today to do 100 things or, explore different things. But the truth of the matter is I was very cautious in a lot of things, and I would have probably taken a few more risks, tried out a few different things. If I was a youngster today, I would take tons of risks, especially when we're young, when life hasn't developed, we don't have the responsibilities yet or anything like that. It's one of the things I suggest is take as many risks and try and learn as much as possible by making mistakes as early on as possible, because that will build up our baseline for our future. And a lot of people don't do that properly, and they take a very cautious approach. They say, "Oh, I have to follow the career path, or I have to do this." And it's like, no, even if you're going to start a product or start a team, a company, and it fails, just try it. And I've seen some people who do that really well, right? And they're doing that. But it's like, yeah, just try it out, right? Test out whatever, because now you can fail. It's a great time to do that. And when I was younger, it was a bit harder. And I think it's one of the things I would like to do more.
Great advice. We're slowly getting close to the end of the episode. Is there something you would like to tell the listeners to check out?
If they want, I have a newsletter, but this year I have not posted a lot because it's been a crazy year. But if you want, I've got the Thoughts Unraveled newsletter. I'll be honest, it wasn't so much about the audience as it was about me. I actually started it as a way for me to have the habit of constantly writing, and it was basically challenging me to write every week. And what it also did was it helped me literally unravel my thoughts. Sometimes it's a well-structured, well-thought-out thought, and I want to put it out there. Other times it's about just, I'm still thinking. I have no idea where this is going to end, but the thoughts that are going through my head are this right now. And the concept there was, if people want to read, perfectly fine, but it's more about challenging me and me writing. And it's been good because I've been able to exchange some experiences with some folks online. So,
well, folks, make sure to check out the newsletter and connect with Hugo on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining this podcast episode.
No, thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure. I hope I didn't talk too much.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you. Wow, you made it till the end. I'm very proud of you. Comment down below which part of the podcast did you like the most and who should I interview next. Also, on the screen, you will see a lot of our other great episodes that you should definitely check out.